The first wave of COVID-19 saw 58,000 excess deaths in Britain. Today, it's been revealed that the government scientific advisors, SAGE, are predicting that the second wave is going to be even worse. So what they're saying is we will never reach the same peaks that we did back in March of 1,000 people dying a day. But because the winter is much longer than that period in early spring, it could be really, really grim. I'm joined by Aaron. We're going to discuss, there's so many things to discuss when it comes to this, which is one, this sort of speculative, how bad is it going to get? But two, are we in a better place than we were back in March? I think what's most interesting, which we're going to discuss today, is why it seems to be hitting exactly the same countries as it hit the first time around. Very, very interesting. So Italy, France, Spain, Britain, Belgium hit really badly the first time, hit really badly this time. You might have expected that the countries who were hit hardest would have learnt from it and therefore might be able to avoid it second time around. That doesn't seem to have happened. Anyway, how are you doing, Aaron?
I'm doing very well, Michael.
You're not feeling a bit down from the news that Christmas is definitely cancelled?
We'll see what happens. It might be that we have a short circuit breaker before then. Maybe. That might be a wise thing to do. One of the strange things about all this is that ahead of Christmas, we're going to have regionalised lockdown protocols, which is ridiculous because obviously millions of people go to see their families over Christmas.
Well, or will they? That's the question.
That's the question. Of course. We have to be frank. Many people will. Of course, they will.
We will be talking about all of this later. We've also got on the show, we're going to be talking about Kim Kardashian's tweet, but only really as an excuse to talk about how lockdowns affect people differently depending on their class background. The rich don't do lockdowns the same as the rest of us. And we're going to finish on Keir Starmer's latest U-turn, which knocked a cyclist off their bike. So all sorts of unanswered questions there, which we shall be exploring in the final part of the show. First of all, you know the score. Share the show link. We want to get more people watching this live. Keep your comments coming in the chat, and especially on the hashtag TyskySour on Twitter. We'll be reading those out through the show. First story. Boris Johnson is under pressure from Britain's chief scientific advisor to take firmer action to contain the coronavirus's second wave. This comes as the Telegraph report that current projections used within Downing Street expect the second wave of COVID-19 to lead to more deaths than the first. It was bad the first time, could be even worse this time around. Let's go to some copy from that article. So they write, while the first COVID wave in the UK saw a sharp spike in deaths peaking in April, Mr. Johnson has been warned that the second wave could last significantly longer. Government scientists feared deaths could remain in the hundreds for at least 3 months and continue long after Christmas, even if the current restrictions remain in place until March. And the Telegraph, this is a visual representation that I think they prepared from this briefing, which we can get up, which sort of shows you the difference between the first wave and the second wave if these projections are proved to be correct. And you can see that the first wave, you've got that huge peak where we end up seeing sort of 1,000 deaths a day within a couple of weeks of the virus first hitting. And the second wave, they're predicting it's going to stabilize at about 500. Obviously it could be a bit higher or a bit lower, but it won't reach quite those same peaks. But the period where there are a lot of deaths will last a lot longer. This to me makes a lot of sense because it seems like actually in retrospect our biggest saviour from the first wave of coronavirus was one, having a really extreme lockdown, which still it seems as if no governments are really countenancing having a lockdown the same degree of severity as we had the first time around. And also it was spring and summer. Spring and summer really seemed to, they were a godsend when it came to getting that pandemic under control. We didn't have to wait that long before the spring came along in the first round. Obviously, it hit us in March. It was getting warmer then. Now we've got a whole winter to survive with people who are, congregating inside. It's very difficult to, I suppose, have a joyful life in the winter without meeting people indoors. So that's going to be a real challenge. There was a telling quote from Wendy Brown. I want to get up. She's a virologist who sits on SAGE, and she told Times Radio yesterday, the total lockdown that we had back in late March was enough to turn the tide and get the virus under control. So far, none of the other restrictions that we've seen and none of the other actions seem to have done that. Again, That probably won't be a surprise to many people. You've seen the restrictions be imposed. You've seen the R rate stay above 1. The virus is still spreading, and this is a top scientist on there, on stage, on the government scientific advisory, sort of spelling it out in primary colours. We know a lockdown works as it stands. We don't know that anything else does. There's still only one successful tool in our toolbox, and it's one that no one really wants to do for very good reasons. Aaron, I want to go to your thoughts on this. Do you think this is overly are these people catastrophizing?
Catastrophists. No, I don't think so. And what's really important to remember here is that 12 months ago, this virus hadn't entered effectively, our species. There hadn't been what epidemiologists called zoonotic spillover. At that point, it was yet to be a pathogen which affected human beings 12 months ago, right? So we don't really know the optimal conditions for it to replicate and infect people. All of the pain and destruction that we saw over the last sort of 6 to 8 months, like you say, has been a very advantageous set of circumstances. If you wanted a viral pandemic to occur at any time, it would be towards the middle of March. Because, of course, first day of spring, March 21st, days get longer, people can go outside more, better weather. This could be even worse than the first one in terms of maximum deaths. We don't know, and that's pure speculation. But I would say, given the role of weather as a variable and how bad things can be, it could be even worse than these. I don't see these people as kind of doomsayers and Cassandras. I think it's going to be very, very, very bad. We haven't endured this yet over the course of a winter, and I would say that actually being quite pessimistic is the rational default.
And it seems like there was lots of I mean, I've engaged in it sometimes. It does seem like the worst is over. Maybe the virus is becoming less deadly. Maybe you don't need a full lockdown to sort of get the R number down. You just need enough behavioural change. People are still behaving very differently to how they did back in the early days of March, which is why we saw peaks of 1,000 people dying a day because people hadn't changed their behaviour at all. The Sweden model, for example, made people think that yes, without a lockdown, lots of people will die, but you can still have society functioning to some degree, and you can still bend the curve. But I think now it's becoming apparent maybe that was just summer happening. So all very worrying. In case we have some people in the audience saying, look, this is just projections. We keep getting projections and we never hit the mark. The best way to test this is to go to projections which were made in the recent past and see if they have come to pass. So to do that test, I want to remind ourselves of a projection Patrick Vallance made back on the 21st of September. So just over a month ago. So it was much maligned at the time, with many pundits accusing Vallance of scaremongering. But let's take a look at the relevant moment from that conference to see how it compares to what actually happened.
So there's no doubt we're in a situation where the numbers are increasing. What I'd like to do is just remind you how quickly this can move. So the next slide is not a prediction, but it is a way of thinking about how quickly this can change. So this is the UK reported cases per day against time. And you can see running along the bottom there, the number of cases over June, July and August, up to roughly 3,000 cases per day or so in September, middle of September. At the moment, we think that the epidemic is doubling roughly every 7 days. It could be a little bit longer, maybe a little bit shorter, but let's say roughly every 7 days. If, and that's quite a big if, but if that continues unabated, and this grows doubling every 7 days, then what you see, of course, let's say there were 5,000 today, it would be 10,000 next week, 20,000 the week after, 40,000 the week after. And you can see that by mid-October, if that continued, you would end up with something like 50,000 cases in the middle of October per day. 50,000 cases per day would be expected to lead a month later, so the middle of November, say, to 200 plus deaths per day.
So when that announcement was first made, there was a press conference before Boris Johnson was implementing some of the new restrictions, which weren't particularly restrictive. But that was Patrick Vallance. He was sitting next to Chris Whitty, sort of giving the latest science. on how coronavirus seemed to be increasing in the country. That particular projection that you just saw there, that graph of sort of it rising slowly and then suddenly doubling once a week and getting high super quickly, there were many people, especially on the political right, who were basically saying this is complete scaremongering, this is complete pseudoscience. What is he talking about? This is ridiculous. How could there possibly be 200 people dying a day by mid-November and 50,000 cases by mid-October? So one of those people who was saying that this was just stupid catastrophizing was Julia Hartley-Brewer, one of Britain's most prominent, I'll be very specific when I say COVID skeptic. She doesn't believe coronavirus doesn't exist, but she thinks we are systematically overestimating its significance and the threat it poses. So she tweeted back in September, and this was before a press conference which was coming out the following days. She says, "Is this when they announced the plague of locusts? Or do you think Whitty and Vallance might admit they're not a prediction of 200 deaths a day wasn't a very honest example scenario?" So she was saying that in response to a press conference that was happening a week later. So you can see that she's saying this is ridiculous. What are they going to predict? What are they going to predict next? 200 deaths by mid-November, 50,000 cases by mid-October. They might as well predict a plague of locusts. It's so ridiculous. Now let's see how it compares to what actually happened, because it turns out their projections weren't all that bad. So let's look at cases. They predicted that there would be 50,000 cases by mid-October. The most recent data from the ONS, and this is the best source of working out how prevalent coronavirus is in the population, because it's not based on how many people get tests, it's sort of a random sample of the population, and then they estimate numbers. So this is from their most recent report. During the most recent week, 10th to 16th of October 2020, we estimate there were around 6.46 new COVID-19 infections for every 10,000 people per day in the community population in England, equating to around 35,200 new cases per day. So there's a 95% chance that is between 29,800 and 46,600. Obviously, this is a bit of a guess, but they're saying this is a solid estimate. So they slightly overestimated how many people would be catching COVID-19 per day by mid-October. And actually, I say overestimate because they were very clear. This is a projection. This is not an estimate. This is what we expect will happen if there is no significant policy change. You can make up your own mind as to whether or not this proves that the policy change that happened was significant enough. Anyway, now let's go to deaths. Because whilst they projected more infections than actually occurred in deaths, it was an underestimate that they made. So we can now get up, this is from the government dashboard, daily deaths. And now this is deaths within 28 days of positive test by date of death. I think we can get this up. So this is showing you there. You see it sort of reaches 200 in the second part of the second half of October. They were only predicting that would happen in the second half of November. Now you might think, oh look, it seems like we've turned a corner, it's peaked. I think that's mainly because this is by date of death and it takes quite a while for deaths to be reported. So it might be the case that the deaths which happened on the 25th of October won't get reported for another few days, and so that won't get updated. To see what I mean, we can now go to the graph, which is deaths by date of the deaths by date of the death being reported, instead of when it actually happened. And you can see there the trend is very clear and it's still going up. So basically what that means is that they were pretty close to being absolutely right. So we've gone from a situation in such a short space of time, and this is where you get a real deja vu from March, where people were saying, look, we're on the same trajectory as Italy. Simple maths shows us that this virus could be out of control and 1,000 people could be dying every day within 2 weeks. Then you get people saying, oh, this is just catastrophizing. I remember going on Sky News and Claire Fox being there saying like, oh, he's just catastrophizing. We're not Italy. Why are you scaring us? And then it happened. And it seems to be that the same cycle is happening again. You had some epidemiologists projecting something. Everyone says, this can't possibly be true. How could we possibly have 200 deaths a day again? That's something that happened in the past. It wouldn't happen in the future. That was something that would have happened in Italy. It wouldn't happen in the UK. And yeah, it does seem like we haven't learned very much, eh?
There's always an excuse, isn't there? It's like with climate change. Oh, this is catastrophizing. We won't get 2 degrees warming. Okay, the potential downsides are really bad. All the science sort of points to it. Yes, we already know the world's warming up. But look, I look outside of my window and everything's fine. People are going to work. People are going to school. What's the problem? And the point is, big issues like pandemics, economic downturns, technological unemployment, demographic aging, these are complex problems. And the far right, or the extreme right, the ultra-nationalist right, some of the people you've just talked about, I would put Julia Hartley-Brewer, for instance, in the sort of the ultra-nationalist sort of hard right. their conception of freedom is just individuals being able to do whatever they like. And they fundamentally have an antipathy to the state because they think that you can't solve complex problems. And this builds on the thinking of like Hayek and Milton Friedman. And Friedman was very clear about this. He said, you can't try and obstruct or impede markets in this providential, almost surreal, irrational way. They deal with these complex problems far better than the state ever can. And so these people's account of freedom and agency just says, look, you might as well not bother with complicated problems. You can never solve them. And look, in the 90s and the 2000s, that has its own problems. In an era of pandemics, an era of climate change, an era of demographic aging, it's just putting up your hands and saying, we can't do anything, which is surreal. It's even more surreal when you have countries a couple of thousand miles away, not particularly rich, who are doing an immeasurably better job. And at a certain point, the British public is going to say, what the hell is happening here? All the jingoism in the world is not going to make up for the huge gap between the fatalities we're seeing in Vietnam or in Cuba or South Korea or China and what we see here. The people like Julia HartleyBrewer can say, well, maybe the Chinese are massaging their statistics. Maybe they are. I don't know. But the number of people dying from this in China is so dramatically, it's a fraction of what we're seeing here, that it can't be ignored. And it speaks to a limit and I think a failure of our social system more generally.
No, I mean, I absolutely agree. It's this idea, if you can't solve the problem, deny there is a problem, which is basically what the right have done over climate change and what they're doing over coronavirus again and again, even when, it's categorically proved, no, the problem is real. If they can't deny, I suppose the first phase for the right is to say, one, oh, it's not a big deal, it's not going to happen. And two, well, if it happens, maybe we should just accept it.
And they do this
instead of addressing that there is a problem which has a solution, they just are not ideologically aligned to the contours of that solution.
You're right, and you've said this before, like, if it was great, by the way, the show you did with Doug was fantastic on Monday, and you guys arrived at a really useful conclusion, which is, if a problem doesn't serve them in an instrumental political way, they just ignore it. Like, if we could absolutely blame immigrants for 60,000 excess deaths as a result of the coronavirus, people like Julia HartleyBrewer would be all over it. They would be like, mask stands. There'd be Julia HartleyBrewer Talk Radio, branded masks. They're doing the complete opposite because the point is you can't blame the left or minorities or the poor. And in a similar way, you said climate change, we're talking about COVID here, child poverty, inequality. If the answers don't suit them, if the questions don't suit them, they just say it doesn't exist. And they're almost, you almost have to admire people like Fraser Nelson who go, actually, child poverty's gone down in the last 10 years. Millions of people have used food banks. We categorically know that's not the case. And again, I can only repeat what I concluded the last time I spoke a moment ago about this. There has to be a point where there's a rupture. People go, look, I can't feed my kids. They can't go to school. I've lost my job. Society's not working. Public services aren't working. You can't run a country by just surrendering to these huge, and let's be frank, existential problems.
I want to get up. We're going to move to Europe in a second because the problems that we're facing in Britain aren't unique. It would be dishonest to pretend they were. I mean, some of them are, to be honest, but lots of them aren't. But first of all, I want to go to one element of policy in England, which has changed over the last 24 hours, and it's kind of an odd one. It's kind of entertaining, to be honest. It's not that serious. This is according to ITV, one of their regional reporters, Max Walsh, which is that whilst Nottingham has moved into Tier 3 later this week, that's going to happen, Bristol will also be moving up a tier, but not from Tier 1 to Tier 2, but into this new mid-tier called Tier 1 Plus. So the simple free-tier system, which turned out to be different wherever it was and based on different criteria wherever it was and with different financial support wherever it was, now cannot even be fitted into free. So we've got Tier 1 Plus, and with below that is Tier 2 minus. Let's get this up. So this is from Max Walsh. The Director of Public Health confirms that Bristol has moved into Tier 1 Plus, which means tighter enforcement, more local control over test and trace, targeted focus on working adults aged 30 to 60, introduction of COVID marshals to patrol city. It's just, I mean, I don't want to get too annoyed about this. It's a silly story, really, but I just think it is quite phenomenal, the fact that you had an announcement just 2 weeks ago where the whole point of it was we're going to introduce a free tier system to rationalize this approach so everyone understands what's happening, so that you can set out these sort of free sets of rules which are quite easy to understand, and people will understand if they're in tier 1, tier 2, tier 3. They'll understand why they're in tier 1, tier 2, tier 3. They'll understand what they can do, what they can't do, what rights they have to support potentially. And then it turns out that's all completely out of the window, and we're in a situation which is just as chaotic as before, but with new names for people to use. Oh, I'm in tier 1A.2. It's completely bizarre, and also could have been foreseen. This just seems to me another example of very poor capacity on behalf of the British state. Not only can they not sort of ramp up a test and trace system in time, they can't even come up with solid plans that they don't have to change the following day. But as I say, we're going to go to Europe now. As ever, we've got well, not as ever, because numbers change, but we've currently got 1,700 people watching. We want to get that to 2,000 while we're still live, so do share the show link.
There's some great super chats. There's a really sweet one that's just come up now. That's why I said it. Can I read this last one out? It's the most recent one that came up. This is from Maria Nazarina Cabani. Can you give a shout out to Martin and Maria, who got married last week and spent their wedding night watching Tysky? Thanks. Keep up the good work. So, Michael, say congratulations to Martin and Maria for getting married.
Congratulations to Martin and Maria. And I can't believe that's. Well, I was going to say that's what I want to do on my wedding night, but I suppose I wouldn't have recorded a Tysky, presumably.
I can see you doing that. You'd be like, you get married and you're saying,
guys, it's 7 p.m.
It's time to have a bit of fun. Clear off. We're going to go to the sort of the matrimonial bedroom, and then you turn on Tysky South.
Right, let's go on to Europe. We've also got Robert Churn with 13 quid. Keep up the good work. Thanks for your help filtering the madness. It is a pleasure to filter the madness for you, and thank you so much for your support. As you know, this show would not be possible without it. As I have said, Britain is not alone in struggling to handle this second wave. For one, France has today, I'm slightly slowing down because this was just announced, so I just had to check what he has announced. Macron has announced that a lockdown in France will start on Friday. I think most things are going to close. I'm going to need to get up a little bit of copy for this, but schools will remain open. While I'm getting the details, we can have a look at why France is, why they see it so necessary to introduce new dramatic measures, because actually, when you look at deaths, they're doing worse than the UK right now. It's even more worrying than it is here. So the most recent report had 522 people dying or deaths reported in the most recent statistics. And you can see there, it's getting close. It's not that far from the first peak. Can we get this up, folks? Yeah, so you can see that in the first peak, you did have a few days where more than 1,000 were reported, and we're already at more than 500 in quite a short space of time, something that people didn't really imagine happening. And I'll get you the details of what Macron has announced in a moment, what particularly he is closing and what he isn't. Before that, though, let's go to Belgium, because this is, what's happening in Belgium is probably the worst situation that we've currently got in Europe. So there, at least 10 hospitals in the worst hit city of Liège have requested medical staff who have tested positive but are asymptomatic to continue their work, with about a quarter of all hospital staff now believed to be infected with COVID-19. And they have a really grim quote in that Indie article. So Philippe De Vos, a consultant and head of the Belgian Association of Medical Unions, acknowledged there was a possible risk of transmission from COVID-positive medical staff who are being told to go back to work, but that they have no choice if they were to prevent the hospital system collapsing within days. Now, wow, that is, Aaron.
Yeah,
when I read that, I was absolutely shocked.
Yeah, it was reported a couple of days ago, and there was another statistic from Liège, not quite as accurate, because they were saying basically 1 in 3 people being tested was testing positive. Now, that doesn't mean 1 in 3 people in Liège has COVID. It just means that, a large number of people being tested, are testing positive, and that's really remarkable. Presumably it's people exhibiting symptoms, more vulnerable people and so on, healthcare workers. What makes it all the more just incomprehensible is that you were hearing things like that from London in sort of March, April. You were hearing things like that from Wuhan, do you remember, in January, February? But it's happening now 6-8 months later in a European city. Liège, Belgium's a really affluent we always thought, this is the home, by the way, of sort of European bureaucracy. You've got the Commission and the Parliament, European Parliament, have a big presence around Belgium, the Netherlands, and France, and these people aren't administering a particularly good response. We knew this could happen. It was always the rejoinder to people on Twitter. They would say, "Look, it's as bad as the flu. Let it pass through." Go, look, this will collapse local healthcare structures if you adopt that approach. And that has implications beyond just COVID, because it then means people who have heart attacks can't be treated. People that, women who are going to give birth to children can't do so in a safe environment, and so on. It's really, really, really bad. It's the one thing you want to avoid. It's why you have lockdowns in the first place. That was the whole conversation. This was the one thing people have to avoid. And it's turned up, it's reared its head in Belgium really, really quickly. And I think that's why you're now seeing in France and Germany the news that you are seeing, which is, they're now going to go into what are being called circuit breakers, probably over the next couple of days. We'll talk about that shortly, I know, but it's to avoid precisely this, what we're seeing in Belgium.
I want to go to so I've got up the new measures which were announced in France, and they are very extreme, actually. They're tighter than I was imagining. So this is from The Guardian. I probably can't get it up, but it says the new measures echo the 8-week lockdown that France enforced in the spring when hospitalizations and deaths caused by the COVID-19 epidemic reached a peak. Signed documents will once again be needed for people to leave home, and moving between regions no longer possible. People can only leave the house to buy essential goods, seek medical attention, or use their daily 1-hour allocation of exercise. But unlike the previous lockdown, most schools are to remain open, while universities will revert to online teaching and working from home will be generalised. Visits to care homes will still be allowed. That's interesting. You haven't been allowed those in this country all summer, as will funerals. Now, that's a really strict lockdown. That's proper first wave style lockdown. No one is allowed to leave their house without documents other than for 1 hour's allocation of exercise. I'm actually surprised by that, because I can't see. Maybe that's what we're going to see in Britain quite soon, because France is only, it seems, about a week ahead of where we are, and they're already going into that kind of extreme lockdown that we saw back in March. Again, this poses the question, is Britain again going to hold out and end up overtaking everyone when it comes to how many deaths we see in this wave, like we did in the first
Do you think we will?
Well, I have to say, I originally thought something will come up and it won't be but basically the summer lulled us all into a false sense of security. And now what's happened is now the weather is getting colder, and especially, I think it's probably partly because kids have gone back to school, that you're seeing this spread in a very similar way to which it did in France, and you're seeing a similar policy response from actually all of the governments. So France went into lockdown before us last time. They're doing it again, and we seem to be inclined to hold out for as long as possible.
I suspect what the Tories will do is they'll basically have 3.2 lockdown, which is more than 3, like akin to what's going on in France. But I do think, places like West Somerset and part of the northwest or the northeast, very lightly populated areas, while the rest of the country is in a basic lockdown. And what that allows Downing Street to say is, well, look, we've had a tailored approach, and I think that's what they'll do. Basically, 90% of us will basically be in a form of lockdown 2.0. I think that's a fair way of looking at it. But it does feel like the localized response isn't born in science. It's not born in best practice. It's more about giving the government a political license to get out of this and actually inoculating themselves from responsibility for what's going to be a very bad sequence of events.
I still find it really weird. However much they talk about local restrictions, Tier 3 is very, very similar to Tier 2. The only thing that, because it was going to be that Tier 3 would have restaurants, pubs, all of these things closed. Then there was pushback because sufficient financial support wasn't offered. And now everything's open apart from pubs that don't serve food.
Yeah, gyms are open.
Gyms are open. So everyone's talking like, it's a huge deal if you go into Tier 3. That's really extreme. It's not at all. It's the same as Tier 2, but the only thing that is closed is pubs that only serve beer. That's a very small section of society.
Can I say, I was going to a gym in the summer, right? I used to love going to the gym. I'm getting old now, so it's even harder work. But I really enjoy doing it. It was really important for my mental health and so on. But in the last couple of weeks, I've obviously just stopped going. I'm just thinking, this is
mad.
This is crazy. How can these places? You're all touching everything. I get a Pure Gym, and this is just, I think this is really remarkable. You have like the detergent spray. they're chained up to stations because they don't want people using too much detergent spray. So you've got to spray it on the tissue, and then you think, this isn't cleaning anything. This is purely performative, right? And when they get shut down, which they will, they have no right to complain. They have absolutely no right to complain.
Well, they probably know they're going to get shut down whatever they do because it's an aerosol spread disease. We're going to go to our final country now. Actually, we're going to discuss Germany a little bit, but Italy is the main one, because what Italy shows is that whilst the spread of the virus seems to be fairly similar to the first round, slightly slower, but just as persistent, and the government responses are quite similar in the extent of bringing in lockdowns as the only possible way of controlling this virus, because in most countries, there are some exceptions. We'll speak about those in a moment. The test and trace systems aren't working amazingly well, or not working well enough to contain this. But what Italy shows is that the political response from the public might be quite different this time around, or has a tendency to be different this time around. So the second wave in Italy has led the Prime Minister Conte to introduce a 6 p.m. curfew for all bars and restaurants. That was announced on the weekend and came into effect on Monday. And it has prompted widespread protests across the country. And we can have a look at the BBC footage of this. This is one of their sort of shareables on social media, which gives you sort of an introduction to what is going on. So I think we can see some scenes now from protests in Italy. So you can see this looks quite different to the kind of cranky characters you get in Trafalgar. Oh, I mean, I've got no idea what the politics of these guys is, but this isn't just a few people waving banners outside Trafalgar Square like you see in this country. This looks like serious social discontent. You've got quite large groups. Here you've got people, what do you call those? Are they Molotov cocktails, I suppose? And you've got a bunch of people there, people smashing windows. So you can see there's a real threat to social order, and when it comes to these protests, it seems like the Italian government is struggling to get consent for their new wave of measures. The BBC reported that this was, these protests were being attended by people on the far left and the far right. They were sort of suggesting that those were the drivers of this movement. But Politico are reporting that in Naples, at least, so Naples is one of the areas which is currently hardest hit. They've currently got the evening curfew. They might be driven by the Mafia. So we're going to go to some quotes from this piece. So Mafia stokes violent anti-lockdown protests in Italy. And as I said, some context here is that Naples is part of the Campania region. That's one of the 3 regions in Italy in which there have been full nighttime curfews. So it's not just that pubs and restaurants are closed, but anything that happens at night has to shut. Worryingly, again, one of those regions is Lombardy, which sort of, puts the nail in the coffin of the idea of herd immunity. If you were hit hard the first time, you won't get hit hard the second time, because Lombardy is one of the 3 hardest hit regions in Italy, and that was the place where coronavirus was, hit the hardest of anywhere in Europe the first time around. Let's go to that Politico article. So they write, at a protest in Naples on Friday, police identified known members of 4 Camorra mafia families who were thought to be directing violence. Protesters threw rocks at police as well as attacking officers inside their cars and damaging the vehicles with clubs. Several journalists were also assaulted. Vincenzo De Luca, the regional governor, described the events as guerrilla warfare. And the article goes on to describe potential motives for the mafia to be involved in anti-lockdown protests. So Giuseppe Antocci, the president of the Fondazione Caponetta, a mafia research centre, said that mob clans oppose curfews and lockdowns because increased police checks and closures affect their ability to demand extortion payments and lead to reduced drug sales revenues. They were devastated by the first lockdown, he said. The mafia clans are also using the protest to foment anger, a general mistrust of the state. He said, it suits them to create a climate of conflict between people and the state. They show that the state is not there for you and offer to help you, in place of the state. In doing so, they widen their network of allies. So this is the picture being put forward by the Italian authorities. They're saying where these protests are most severe and where they're most violent, they're being driven by the mafia. That is not an analysis which is accepted by everyone in Italy, including Maurizio Coppolo, who is a freelance journalist based in Naples, who is also an activist with Potere al Popolo. Potere al Popolo, which is the populist left party in Italy. Earlier today, I asked him whether he bought this analysis that the mafia were behind the protests.
No, not at all. It's clear we have to focus on social and political dynamics for understanding and judging the social protest, it is clear that with the announce of the possibility of a second lockdown, a lot of people were touched by this, because they say we survived more or less the 3 months of lockdown, of first lockdown from March to May. But as also like a study, research of the Caritas showed that the new poor, there are like around 500,000 people all over Italy that got poor only during these 3 months. They got poor because they didn't have savings after 3 months. So after 3 months, they do not have money, and they know now that without money, it is really difficult to survive. So the announcement of the possibility of a second lockdown just mobilized people to say this is not possible to live like this, because the announcement of the lockdown was not accompanied by clear declarations that social measures would be taken for helping working people.
So that was Maurizio Coppola talking about, that this is, again, and this is going to be a situation which is familiar to all of our audience. You've got a government who has belatedly realised they've got to implement quite severe public health measures, in this case, a curfew in the evening, but hasn't this time around been willing to cough up the cash to make that tolerable to the general citizenry. So you've got this real mismatch between the public health measures and the economic support which goes along with it. This is something that seems to be very common to Italy, Spain, France, and the UK, partly because they were like, we've spent so much before, we can't possibly do that again. But if the virus is still here, you're going to have to do that again, right? You're going to have to. I mean, Italy is in a difficult situation because they're within the euro. They can't really just have their central bank buy up all the debt in the same way that we can in Britain. But nonetheless, I mean, I presume the EU is going to have to get more ambitious with this. What are your thoughts on that, Aaron?
Yeah, I think the Mafia story is a lot of nonsense.
I mean, he said, to be honest, Maurizio said to me that the Mafia probably are, to some extent, exploiting this because they can step in when the state is vacating that space and build up some influence. But he's saying the idea that this is a conspiracy where the Mafia are driving this is nonsense. Yeah.
No, I mean, if you there is a huge history of radical protest in Italy going back a very long way, both on the far right and the far left. I don't like to draw an equivalence between those two, but that's just a fact. And the reality is that polarized politics in Italy, you have Salvini right now, he's arguably the most successful right-wing politician in Western Europe. You have the rise of Casa Pound. You have the rise of anti-immigrant sentiment in Italy. You've had the Eurozone has been an unmitigated disaster for Italy. It's been destroyed by the Eurozone, probably more than any other country. Living standards have gone nowhere for 20 years. It's kind of like the Japan of Europe. And it's been hammered in particular since the global financial crisis because of the Eurozone. So I think society in Italy is fraying at the edges. Politics has been polarizing already for 15 years, and then you get COVID-19. So of course you're going to see these protests. I remember in 2011, I think it was the Ministry of Finance, the Ministry of the Interior, it was set on fire during a protest in 2011. It was sacked. That's the word for it. And that's just people protesting against, Eurozone-led austerity. And so I think you're right. On the one hand, this tells us that, yes, it doesn't have the resources to address a second spike, but it also doesn't really have a big reservoir of public consent either, in a way that you do in England and Britain. Yes, we've had austerity and so on. It's been horrific the last 10 years, but nothing like Italy. Italy in that respect is much closer to somewhere like Greece. Youth unemployment, huge. And by the way, and that's after millions of people have gone to other European countries. If they'd stayed there, it would be it is an epidemic, youth unemployment. So think of it this way. You're a young person. You might be university educated. You haven't had a proper job for 2, 3, 4 years. You live with your parents. Then COVID-19 comes along. How invested do you feel in the political system? Not very. So, yeah, the Mafia may be playing a role, but I come on. Let's be honest here. This is the country of Casa Pound, of the Red Brigades, the rise of fascism, the year of 77. The protest culture of the 60s and 70s in Italy was stronger than anywhere else in Europe. I don't buy that argument that it's monocausal, led by the Mafia for 1 second. Too simplistic and almost certainly wrong.
And there's a reason why the authorities are saying that, right? Because the authorities don't want to say, oh, actually, it is because we implemented these public health measures without giving anyone the necessary financial support. So you look for excuses in a similar way that you saw here when, the government were constantly trying to blame any failure of their policies on specific bogeymen, members of the public who are supposedly breaking the rules. I mean, obviously the Mafia is slightly different to members of the public breaking the rules, but there we go. You see where I'm going with that. What I wanted to bring up, though, is this point, because we've showed you sort of the countries which are comparable to the UK, who are having very similar problems to the UK right now. So we've shown you Belgium, France, Spain. Belgium, France, Italy, we could also add to that, Spain, the Netherlands. But COVID hasn't hit every country the same. And what's very interesting about this second wave is that the same group of countries who had a really poor first wave of coronavirus, who had loads of deaths the first time around in the first half of this year, are being hit in exactly the same way again. Now, I put in a bunch of countries to our world in data today to sort of explain or present the point. And I'm only showing you sort of how many people in the second wave have been dying in these various countries. So I think we can get graphic 11 up, Fox. And what you can see there is that you've really got three groups. So in the top, and this is only in the last month, you can see that deaths per million people are rising, dramatically in France, Spain, the UK, and Netherlands, and Italy, all very much in line with each other, all quite high. In Spain and the United States, they never actually went that low because they've had some real sort of problems of governance in those countries. But those are all the same countries. This is the second wave. Those are all the same countries who had terrible first waves. Very little difference there. So one, this sort of shows that herd immunity was a bit of a fallacy as a way of dealing with this crisis, because the countries who had a bad first wave are also having a bad second wave. But it also sort of points out something fundamental. What is it about these countries that means it's going so bad? Then you've also got two other groups there at the bottom. So doing quite well is Germany and Denmark. And then doing incredibly well, very few deaths whatsoever, you've got Japan, Norway, South Korea, and China. Sweden on there is actually doing quite well in the second wave, which I think also tells us something quite specific, which is that, and I want to put this to you, Aaron, what is it about those countries at the top? Because they've got, Spain have got a government of the centre-left. Mm-hmm. We've got a government of the sort of populist right. Sweden had a sort of anti-lockdown policy, and now in the second wave, which sort of put them out of step with those countries that are lower down. But now they've got a policy which is more in line with the rest of the world, a sort of loose lockdown that everyone else has got. They're still on that bottom row. And it does seem like Scandinavian economies, East Asian economies, and then the sort of coordinated market economies like Germany, there's something about them that means that they can handle COVID-19. And there's something about Britain, the United States, Spain, France, Italy, which means they can't. And it does seem to be structured, do you know what I mean? Because the governments are quite different. And it can't just be down to initial policy mistakes, because we're seeing exactly the same division in the second wave as we saw in the first.
Yeah, and you can't just put it down, for instance, things like population density, urbanization, which would be variables, of course. But then you look at China and you look at the US. The US is a huge country. It has a huge agrarian economy. So you could argue, well, the Netherlands and Britain, they have this issue in particular because of population density. Well, so does Denmark, right? They're not having anything near, although it should be said that Netherlands and the UK are more densely populated, I believe, than Denmark. I could be wrong. Similar with Belgium, very densely populated.
Well, let's put in Hong Kong. Come on, that's like the most densely populated place in the world, and they've dealt with it very well. The East Asian countries are incredibly densely populated.
There are other variables, right, which I think that pretty partially explains, for instance, Sweden. Sweden is a huge country. It's one of the biggest countries in the European Union, population of 10 million. So, that's clearly a variable, but I think you're absolutely right. I think it's so stark, if we can maybe pull the image back up, it is so stark, and the trends are so stark, that I think fundamentally it does boil down to political economic model. Has to. And China, South Korea, Japan in particular, China in particular. And this isn't just they're better at this than we are, although they are. That's also an outgrowth of the fact that East Asia's had to deal with 3 separate distinct coronaviruses over the last 20 years. SARS
the Scandinavians didn't know.
I agree with you entirely. So that's a really serious point. So, okay, maybe we could never have been like Japan and South Korea because we haven't had the practice run, so to speak, that the East Asian countries had. But the same applies for Germany or Denmark or Norway. And that's a really serious question, I think. And I would have expected Britain to be there, the US to be there, maybe even France, but the Netherlands. This is a country that's widely regarded as being a pretty solid administrative state. I would have expected Spain and Italy to be there because their state structures are just broken after the last 10 to 15 years. But I think there's something really profound going on there. And look, if this does, and I think we're agreed on this, the next 6 months are going to be far worse than the first 6 months of this crisis. I think it's not just going to raise questions about the political model of these countries. I think even political elites themselves will start to say, okay, this probably isn't going to function. This isn't really going to maintain mass consent. And that's a real crisis point.
You've heard Aaron's view, you've heard my view about why these countries are differing so wildly and consistently. And we can now look at the view of Dr. Michael Ryan. He leads the World Health Organization's COVID response. So this is about a week ago in a press conference. He explained why some countries, particularly in East Asia, crushed the curve while the US and Europe, or some countries in Europe, are losing control over the pandemic.
I think was a focus on case detection, case isolation, and especially quarantining of contacts. The continued quarantining and supporting those contacts in their quarantine, not just sending people home, but supporting them in that process, physically supporting them, providing them with accommodation, providing them with food, providing them with social support. And if you think in any one time in a community transmission environment between 1 in 400 and 1 in 500 people may be carrying, maybe actively positive for COVID-19 or for SARS-CoV-2. Well, if you imagine that one person is a case and they have 10 contacts, if I isolate that case and quarantine those contacts, that's 11 people who are affected by the measure, as opposed to a lockdown, which is 400 to 500 people affected by the measure. And the success the countries had in Asia was their ability to find those 11 people, find that case and those contacts. Maybe not all the cases, but enough cases to start breaking the chains of time and to continue doing that.
So we're saying the only way is test and trace. Well, test and trace or a lockdown, and if you do a lockdown, you affect a lot more people than if you do test and trace. Also, what I thought was really interesting there is at the beginning he emphasizes that what matters so much is supporting people when they have to isolate. It's something that public health experts have been, screaming at this government all year, which is if you want to have a test and trace system that works, you have to fund people properly to self-isolate. The levels of compliance in this country with requests to self-isolate is pitifully low. I think it's less than half. I think significantly less than half, actually. People who are told you've contacted someone who's got coronavirus. And the government response here has been to say, we'll reduce it from 14 days to 7 days, and hopefully that will increase compliance. That was a news story that came out this week. It hasn't been announced. It's been briefed. Maybe that does make sense. But what would make more sense is to give people some money to stay in their house. The idea that is something that is deemed beyond the capacity of the British state is just completely bizarre.
Can I just quickly say, from personal experience of this? My partner, my fiance, had to travel abroad to oversee a legal issue relating to a parent who'd passed away. So she had to leave the country. We have no plans to go anywhere where, the travel corridors, I think that's a legitimate thing. But I think going to somewhere which is a dangerous place to go, I think people should generally try not to do that. She went there, she came back, she had to quarantine for 2 weeks. And as we know, there are these sort of spot inspections. If you're not there, you'll be fined. So she didn't leave the house for 2 weeks. But I was there, right? I could leave as I pleased. And as I've already said earlier on the show, I've tried to absolutely limit my contacts with people. I could go as I please. And then, towards the end, I was like, I wonder how rigorous this really is. And I was looking at the exemptions. And basically, if you really need to leave the house, you can leave the house. So if you really need to get some groceries because nobody else will, you can go and get some groceries, kind of thing. And I thought, God, this is not functioning. This is not a functional system of self-quarantine. This is not going to work. And I think, and that's what you've been so good at over the last 6 months with this crisis, is you look at each of these government measures and you go, this is laughable. This is purely performative. And look, it's fine to be performative when you've got Carillion collapsing or where a mass public infrastructure project is 200% over budget. It's not going to work when people's lives are at risk. And still, the public gets that, but still I think that the government thinks they can get away with it.
So true. We're going to go to our final country now before we move on to sort of a broader COVID theme in a moment about, riffing off that Kim Kardashian tweet, which I'm sure you have seen. But first of all, let's go to what is really giving me deja vu. France has locked down before us, but with more cases, but still sort of earlier in the epidemic curve than it seems possible that we will, because the government is still so averse to that kind of thing. But Germany currently they are seeing a big spike in their infections, but they currently have half the number of daily cases as the UK, half. But Merkel today will announce, or already has announced, apologies, a month-long circuit breaker lockdown, closing all restaurants, gyms and theatres. So it's gone way further than anywhere in Britain, even if you're in tier 3 in Britain. They're saying, this is an incredibly dangerous place to be. You can still have restaurants and gyms open, right? Germany has gone ahead and said, look, we're at a point where we've got half the amount of infections as the UK, and we're going to have to take more extreme measures than the UK. That's a responsible government. What happened last time around? Do you remember back in March where Germany went into a lockdown so much earlier than us in the epidemic curve, and they saw so many fewer deaths? I saw the headline today, Germany reaches 10,000 deaths. I think that was today. I was like, only 10,000? Wow. If you've got a big headline because you've had 10,000 deaths, you've done very, very well. And this is significant. So this is from the Reuters article I just showed you the headline of. So it says a 10 billion euro aid package will pay companies that have to close a share of their lost sales during the shutdown. Smaller companies with up to 50 employees will receive 75% of the year earlier revenues for the month of November. Now, that's pretty incredible, right? That's a lot of money. And they've decided if we want to take serious public health measures, to get consent for that, we're going to have to cough up. And I mean, what's interesting about that as well is I know our government has sort of done these sort of bespoke loans for various different companies here, there and everywhere. But this ability to just say, look, we'll do this universal policy, which basically gives everyone close enough to what they need, 75% of their revenue. Obviously, some of your costs aren't going to apply if your business isn't opening. 75% is probably going to carry you on, going to make you able to survive and comply with all of those conditions. And they're just coughing it up for every small company. I mean, the other good thing about this, and this is why I quite like the self-employed policy in this country, is that it rewards people who declare their actual income. So the people who are going to be annoyed about this are the people who hide a lot of their income. And this just seems like a rational, sensible approach. I'm sure it's going to work. It's going to work. We're going to go to some super chats. Loads of super chats, which is amazing. We love to see it. Wild Bunny with a £5. Finally, I catch you live so I can super chat. Love all of you, the voice of reason in these wild times. Best wishes to Ash, who all of our regular viewers will know is currently suffering from coronavirus. But I think she's improving. I'm sure we're going to get her on this live show soon. I miss her as much as you do. El Farah 96, new junior doctor here, about to start my 4th night shift. Thanks for keeping me sane throughout what's been a really scary intro to the job. Have an hour's wage to help Michael get his call-in tech. I'm so keen to get that call-in tech. I love it when junior doctors comment on here. You keep fighting the good fight. And yeah, I mean, I feel for you. This does sound like a scary intro to the job. And I mean, I think doctors and people who work in healthcare are who we really need to listen to, because when you've got people like Julia HartleyBrewer saying, look, it only kills this many people. You speak to doctors and nurses, are like, literally, we were running out of oxygen. We had wards where people were dying and they couldn't see their it sounds like hell in hospitals in the middle of a global pandemic. And you've got Julia HartleyBrewer saying, they were 80 anyway. Maybe we should just relax. It's like, there are people on the front line who knew the costs of that first round. And it wasn't just the 50,000 dead was tragic, but that wasn't necessarily, they were quite old, most of them. For me, the most tragic thing is you've got people dying who can't see their family. You've got people who are, you have to tell people, you have to triage people to say, you can't get help. I'm sorry. That was in the Sunday Times this weekend. It's the decisions you have to make when coronavirus gets out of control are just horrific, and they're kind of decisions that someone like Julia HartleyBrewer will never have to make.
But there's a lot of older people in this country. The way it's kind of depicted is it's like a minority. Well, it is a minority, but it's not this tiny number of people. I think we have more over 60s in this country than under 5s.
And it's over 80s who's the age of who dies. Obviously, loads of over 60s, loads of people in their 60s have died, but it is very strongly weighted to the over 80s.
No, I know, but we were looking at the data, I remember, towards this, and we were looking at, for instance, over 60s that enter ICU. It's pretty bad, actually. You're
getting better.
Yeah, no, of course it is, because of applications of things like, was it Regeneron?
I don't think we're rolling out Regeneron yet in this country.
No, I know, but
steroids.
Steroids is a very cheap steroid, in fact, which is fantastic news. My dad was given one of them because he's an asthmatic. But my point is, there was that 83-year-old lady in Barnsley saying, I just want to see my grandkids. I don't need to be kept alive. And I was thinking, well, how old's your daughter or your son? Are they like 60? Because, they're also a risk, right? And it's just people with underlying risk factors. So mild asthma, right? Or, you've
diabetes.
Had
Hell of a lot of people have diabetes.
You've had a heart attack 10 years ago. We're talking about millions of people here. You can't just be laissez-faire and say, oh yeah, maybe 10 million people might be in trouble. Okay. Are you serious? 400,000 people died, I believe, to the best of my knowledge, 400,000 people died in combat in this country in the Second World War. What are you going to say? Well, that's okay, right? What kind of number here is acceptable? And the reality is, and it's positive, like you say, the treatment is getting better. There's a possibility we get vaccines next year. All the more reason why. Let's just go big on the economic stimulus right now. What's the worst that can happen?
I'm going to finish these super chats. Jess Delves with €20. Thank you very much. Could you please say happy birthday to my mate Matt? We met on election day last year, canvassing in the rain, and have since become great friends. He introduced me to Novara and is a generally all-round good comrade. Wonderful story. Happy birthday, Matt. Keep introducing people to Novara Media. Jess, I'm very glad you found us. And we'll go through these quickly. Phil with a $5, thank you very much. TJI with $10 Canadian. Baz Cams with a $5 who says, have it. We will, and in return, we will bring you this show every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 7 p.m. If you don't want to miss any of those shows, hit subscribe. You know what to do. Right, next story. Lockdowns aren't the same if you're rich. We've always known it, but it became almost hilariously obvious in a tweet thread posted by Kim Kardashian this week. It's gone absolutely viral for good reason, but it does raise, some important realities when it comes to how people of different classes and different backgrounds experience a global pandemic. So let's go straight to this tweet thread. It's ridiculous. So she says, 40 and feeling so humbled and blessed. There is not a single day that I take for granted, especially during these times when we are all reminded of the things that truly matter. For my birthday this year, I couldn't think of a better way to spend it than with some of the people who have helped shape me into the woman I am today. Before COVID, I don't think any of us truly appreciated what a simple luxury it was to be able to travel and be together with family and friends in a safe environment. After 2 weeks of multiple health screens and asking everyone to quarantine, I surprised my closest inner circle with a trip to a private island where we could pretend things were normal just for a brief moment in time. There's so many... The bit I love about this is how it's all of this sort of like sort of cheesy card sort of slogans, like the kind of thing you get in a Hallmark card. The things that really matter. And you think she's going to say spending some time with your family. The things that really matter is just being able to have a lie-in, be with the person you love. The things that she literally flew in a private jet to a private island. Most people, it's not like what are the things that really matter? It's the people no, it's completely bananas. Anyway, if you were worrying that Kim Kardashian didn't have self-awareness, never fret. This was the tweet that ended the thread. We danced, rode bikes, swam near whales, kayaked, watched a movie on the beach, and so much more. I realized that for most people, this is something that is so far out of reach right now. So in moments like these, I am humbly reminded of how privileged my life is. Hashtag, this is 40. It's not 40 for many people, Kim. There is an obvious point here, though, which is that lockdowns are very different if you're rich. You don't have to be as mega rich as Kim Kardashian for them to be very different, but they are very different if you're as rich as her, but also if you're just middle class, right? And there are some obvious points to make here. So working from home is much comfier, much easier if you've got a big house. If you're renting in the inner city, if you live in a small home with a large family, lockdown is going to be much more stressful than if you have a studio or a sort of spare. What do you call a room where you can a study? I've forgotten what that room would even be called.
A spare
it's
room.
So alien to my life. A spare room, that would be another one, wouldn't it? You don't get those in Hackney, I can say.
We get them in many places. Anyway, finish your point.
Anyway, but yeah, it's also we're going to go through some other stories this week that came out about them because it's also travel, which is affected. So this is a story that was in City AM. High-flying city figures to be exempt from quarantine rules. So this is the story that city deal makers, hedge fund managers and executives flying into the UK are set to be exempt from the current 14-day quarantine period in a bid to promote global Britain. And the Sunday Times got a really good quote on this. So the quote says, "It seems ridiculous that people who are coming to the UK for 5 or 6 meetings in a day and then flying out are forced to quarantine, especially when most of them come in private jets and have a chauffeur-driven car." That's a government source in the Sunday Times. I'm going to go to you, Aaron. I want your thoughts on the government source saying, why would we apply the same rules to people who are in chauffeur-driven cars in private jets? Why should they have to follow the same rules as everyone else? And Kim Kardashian thinking that she was, humbly aware of her privilege when she tweeted that #ThisIs40 meant that she got to spend a time on a private island with all her loved ones for her 40th birthday.
See, if you're trying to be generous with Kim Kardashian, the point she's trying to make is that the really valuable things in life are personal connections, friends, family, which you can't buy, which is true, right? And I do think there's an element of COVID maybe being something of a kind of values reset for a lot of people. Now, obviously not her, obviously not these people who are coming to the country reported in City AM and the Sunday Times, but I do think, it's triggering a sort of broader mind shift. And I remember at the start of this pandemic, there was a billionaire who had a private boat, and he said, "I'm just going to see this out on my private yacht." I don't know if you remember this. And the point is, well, when you come back, what do you think is going to happen? It's magically disappeared. The world's going to be the same as before. No, this is a really big event. This is like a major war, or the discovery of a terrible, new invention like the atom bomb. We don't go back to before COVID, right? This is a new world, and so I think that can be positive in terms of people's values. There was a positive truth content there, which I think we should acknowledge. At the same time, it's a really important point, which is that COVID is here, but it's not evenly distributed. And I think in that respect, the story about, the 5 or 6 meetings in one day, why would you want to quarantine? Just do it online. You're so rich. Get a good internet connection, get a good mic, get a good camera. What's the problem?
Everyone else is doing it on Zoom.
Yeah.
This idea of, but if they get a private jet and they get the chauffeur, who are they going to come in It doesn't fucking matter. If everyone is doing meetings on Zoom, if everyone is meeting their grandkids on Zoom, then this rich motherfucker should have his business meeting on Zoom.
And also, all these huge multinational businesses, they're all, the one post everybody's recruiting now is head of remote. This is like the new thing. This is like a C-suite job, right? You get the chief technology officer, chief, executive officer, financial officer, and now they're like, the CRO, chief remote officer. And, it's understandable if you have a staff of 20, 30,000 people, it's a huge challenge. So you can't on the one hand say, Goldman Sachs and Deutsche Bank and General Electric are looking at how to work remotely, but this executive guy, he has to meet people face to face. And why should he need quarantine? He's meeting 5 or 6 people face to face. That's why he needs quarantine. Right?
Exactly.
Yeah,
he might meet less people than if he took the tube, but he's not meeting less people than if he used Zoom. And I think part of this is interesting, is that one of the reasons why you have so much global business travel isn't because it's necessary. It doesn't actually add any economic output to society. It's basically that people who have these incredibly well-paid jobs quite like having meals with other people who have incredibly well-paid jobs. We have our next piece of evidence, which is about how socializing is felt differently by different sections of society. And I like this one because this was forwarded to us by a Tysky Sour viewer. So it's a mail out from a fancy London restaurant reassuring you that you shouldn't let COVID-19 restrictions affect your life. Now, any eagle-eyed people might notice it says March 2020 there, but I saw it when the email was sent by Caprice Restaurants. It was definitely a week ago, so presumably they haven't updated their image. This was from a week ago in October. So they write, "We are receiving a multitude of calls and emails from people regarding some confusion with government guidelines relating to restaurants. We wish to make it clear, when the topic is business, you can still meet over a fabulous working lunch or dinner without the restriction of the 6 household rule, i.e. mixed households are permitted up to 6 guests. And it goes on. "We can host up to 30 people with our private dining spaces for business meetings. Finally, guests are allowed to dine with mixed households on our outside terrace with up to 6 people. We hope this clears up any confusion. We very much look forward to seeing you soon." Now, this company owns sort of restaurants such as the Ivy, a famous one where celebrities are often seen dining with each other. And I think what you can see here is if what needs to happen is business people so desperately need to be in the same room that they can, come up with some weird ass productive decision which couldn't have been made on. It doesn't make any sense to begin with. But if you took the assumption at face value that it's really important for top businessmen to be in the same room as each other, why does it have to be in a fancy restaurant? If what these people are doing is economically necessary and so necessary they can break the same rules that everyone else is following, why can't they do it in a normal ventilated room that isn't serving lobster? Do you know what I mean? There's no justification for this. And I mean, it's within the rules. I'm not claiming these people are breaking the rules. It's perfectly within the rules, which is precisely the problem here. It's to say, if you want to call your meeting a business meeting, you go ahead and do it. And who has business meetings? Very wealthy people. Who has business meetings in fancy restaurants? Not most of the population, right?
Also, a lot of serious people just don't like wasting time. I don't know if you've noticed this. Like, often people are, let's talk about this, let's go make for coffee. And 9 times out of 10, it's bullshit. You don't need to do it. It's a complete waste of everyone's time. They just wanted to have a chat and hang out. And you're like, look, I've got 5 minutes. Let's talk over the phone. Let's talk over Zoom. A lot of people are actually doing Zoom now, and they're saying, this is so much better. I can actually, the hour I spent traveling around London to go from A to B to have a stupid meeting with someone, I can now go to the gym or be with my partner. Well, not in the gym because the gyms are shut, but they should be shut. I can be with my partner, or I can watch a film, or I can learn a language. People did sourdough last time. Maybe next time will be something a bit more interesting. And it's a really important point. We were wasting a lot of time. Why do that? All these technologies have allowed us to be a lot more efficient, productive. So stop wasting time to be unproductive. And I don't say that from a sort of, Stakhanov be as productive as you can. After this, we need to talk about moving to a 4, even maybe a 3-day working week, which means not having stupid, fraffy meetings where people don't do anything and where it's all performative.
My fear is that this is mainly men who don't like their families. So business travel and sort of the business meeting that happens in the restaurant is men who want an excuse to get away from their family so they can get drunk and, I don't know, maybe sleep with prostitutes. I'm not saying that happens in that restaurant. That would be libelous. I'm just saying in general. Cocaine in the toilets, that kind of vibe.
Does that still happen?
Yeah, well, that's what drives these. That's why you get so much business travel.
Do you think there's a nexus around like pure hedonism, which presents itself as... that's a different analysis. Mine is, this is like a mindset which is completely out of sync with the technological possibilities. You're like, actually, this is just a license to get drunk as much as possible.
It's going to be a very interesting sociological question, because I think in some ways, sort of like how we live as a society is determined by how elites want to live and what they see as consistent. And I think there's going to be a big division between bosses, people high up in industries that sort of like their family, who are sort of suggesting, actually, maybe we should all start working from home most of the days of the week. Maybe we could go to a 4-day week. There are people who have discovered during this lockdown period that they quite like having some time out of work. That's going to be some firms. And then other firms are run by people who they love going to work because they don't like their family and they don't have any friends, and they like to be in a room where people have to speak to them
That's true.
Where people have to look
and
up
they've
to them
got no life.
And brown nose them, and they like having a free meal of lobster. So we're going to have sort of the future of our work-life balance determined by whether there are more kind of sociopaths in the top of these industries, or people who are, quite nice parents and like their friends. Right, we're going to go on. Very quickly, we're going to do health in like 2 minutes, super quick. So this is how the strain on the NHS is unevenly felt. So this is a Guardian story. Fears of two-tier system as NHS waiting lists prompt more people to go private. Compare the market. So there have been an average 40% increase in year-on-year private health insurance sales over the past 7 months. People are also going into, so they spoke to someone who was going into their savings to get cancelled operations done privately. The person in this article was not a morally abject person. It's just that if people who have savings, they want the operation, they get it. But if you don't have 12,000 in savings and your operation's been cancelled due to COVID, you can't get it. So you're seeing a massive health inequality here, which could also outlive the pandemic. If lots of people are getting private health insurance, their buy-in to the NHS decreases. How would we resolve this? We would have an NHS which doesn't usually reach full capacity in a normal winter, so that when we have a pandemic, hospitals don't collapse. They haven't collapsed in Germany. It doesn't have to be this way. Right, we're going to go on to our final story. Before we do that, some more super chats. Lewis Chaplin, 1419 with a tenner. Here's a misery tenner from a newly misery tenner from a newly locked down France. Sorry, mate. Looking forward to tuning in live 3 times a week while things go stir crazy. Do let us know how it's going in France. It's a very interesting place to be right now, even if it might be kind of boring being stuck in your home. Lieu Exquise with Fiverr. I recognise your name because you've given us super chats before. Thanks again. NM's analysis was really ahead of the curve on the pandemic. WHO clip repeats points made here a while back. Yes, of course. So what do you have to do? You have to support people to lockdown. We've been saying it for months, and it wasn't an original thought. The WHO have been saying it for months, but our government is ignoring the obvious. Spell it, bang. Good name. With Fiverr. Hi guys, Aaron stated in the first lockdown that we would have a whole show discussion on universal basic income. Can he let us know when that will be? We don't normally do whole show discussions on one topic.
Not anymore.
We break it into sort of 10-minute sections, but maybe we can find 10 minutes.
We do these interviews on Tuesdays. We couldn't do it this week because Ash was ill. I'll be doing one next week with a very interesting guy called Dan Hicks on a book he's written called The British Museums. Amazing book. UBI, we talked about it briefly with the Rutger Bregman interview. But it's true. I mean, like you say, a whole show. I mean, that would be more like this is what you were kind of leaning into before the COVID stuff was debates. But you were doing that a lot, right? You know, when you had Tom Kibasi versus Wes Streeting. I suppose you could do that with UBI.
Debates were very good when we were about to enter government because it'd be like this policy or that policy. And I was like, well. Anyway. Right. Charlie Dobson, enjoying tonight's show as I recover from COVID. I was going to say, it sounds like you're dealing with it well. Thanks to NM for inspiring my dissertation topic from your fantastic coverage of the Spy Cops bill. Interesting. You can tell us, I hope your dissertation goes well. Samantha Bond with a tenner. Tarana Amadi Parker with a fiver. Tarana donates regularly, apparently. Fox has noticed. We do love your regular donations. Well, no, we do love your super chats. But we also love when you go to our website and donate via the website. That's our most important income source is regular donors on the website. If you do want to make Novara Media Tysky Sour possible, if you want to help us continue to grow, upgrade our tech, become more regular, add phone-in features, maybe that's something we've got in the pipeline, do please go to novaramedia.com/support and donate the equivalent of 1 hour's wage a month so we can keep working. At the moment, I was going to say, we're going to ultimately be working around the clock in the sense of having a 24-hour news show. That would be sick. Right, final story. It's a good one.
This is a great story.
It's less somber than all the previous things we've been discussing. Keir Starmer won the Labour leadership in emphatic style earlier this year after promising to be similar to Corbyn in policy, but emphatically different in presentation. Things like committing to a green economy while looking after workers in the gig economy and on 0 hours contracts would remain central to his leadership. But he would, dress it up quite differently. Well, a story from last weekend most certainly attests to the presentation bit, because while Starmer's predecessor, Jeremy Corbyn, was famed for cycling around his London constituency, it appears Starmer's transport choices are just a little bit different. He was found. We know that he was driving around Holborn and St Pancras, driving an SUV, a sports utility vehicle, otherwise known by Londoners as a Chelsea tractor. We can get up the news story here. Keir, under police investigation after a collision that saw a cyclist taken to hospital. Now, we can't show the image of the SUV. We'd love to, but there's copyright and so on. It's taken by paparazzi or someone of the sort who would want us to give them quite a lot of money. You can look it up online. It might be a hybrid, which would be something, but it's quite big. In any case, it's been reported that whilst travelling to his tailor around midday on Sunday, Starmer attempted to pull a U-turn, though Starmer's team claim he was just parking, although the street in question is double yellows on both sides. So some questions raised there. It was at this point that he hit a Deliveroo driver on a bike. So this is from the Daily Mail, who unsurprisingly are doing the investigation on this story. No love lost between them and Keir Starmer. So this is a quote from a witness named Daryl. So Daryl says, there were a few scuff marks on the driver's side door. At first, the cyclist was on the ground, but then he was helped up and sat outside the Oyo Hotel, holding his left arm and crying in pain. I didn't know who the driver was at the time, but he went over to the cyclist who was shouting at him, "How did you not see me?" Make of that what you will. Daryl, who said he stayed at the scene until the cyclist was taken away to a local hospital for treatment, added, even if Keir was parking, he was still doing a U-turn because he was on one side of the road, swung his car around and hit the cyclist who was coming from the opposite direction. We can get a statement from another witness who added, the SUV was across the middle of the road for a few minutes after the accident, and then the driver pulled it over to one side because a lot of traffic was building up. He got out of the car, spoke with the cyclist for a few minutes, and then eventually left. We didn't know it was secure at the time, but it was a stupid and dangerous place to do a U-turn. Now, so there's a few things here. Ultimately, obviously, you think this is a meaningless story. We're having a jab at the leader of the Labour Party because he's not as aligned politically with us as the previous one. But there are some notable points here. So firstly, the one place that has excellent public transport in the UK is Zone 1 and 2 in London, where Keir Starmer's constituency is in Holborn and St Pancras. Quite easy to get the tube there, although I suppose there is a pandemic going on. The other question, how serious... Even if you could say about COVID-19, coronavirus, right, that he didn't want to take public transport because there's a pandemic on, he didn't need to be driving an SUV. He doesn't need to have an SUV. He lives in North London. This is why SUVs are so unpopular in London. That's why they're called the Chelsea Tractor, because they're not really designed to be in inner cities. You don't need one. Even if this is a hybrid, it's probably not good to be driving this if you live in Kentish Town, not in the Yorkshire Dales. What's more, SUVs are dangerous, right? So local authorities should consider banning SUVs from town and city centres to protect cyclists and pedestrians, according to a Brussels-based safety think tank that advises the European Commission. This is from the European Transport Safety Council, the ETSC. So they write, research shows that the risk of severe injury or death for a pedestrian is higher in collisions with sports utility vehicles and vans compared to passenger cars. Three designed factors influence more severe collisions. SUVs and vans are stiffer, they have higher bumpers and are heavier. A separate article in The Guardian cites British academics who have analysed police collision data and identified pedestrians as 70% more likely to be killed if they were hit by someone driving a 2.4-litre engine vehicle than a 1.6-litre model. So big cars matter. The size of your car matters to how dangerous it is to be driving in a city, both to cyclists and to pedestrians. If you don't need a car that big, you probably shouldn't have one. Adam Reynolds, one of the researchers, said if you're hit by a large engine car, you're almost twice as likely to be killed. It makes sense. That's not rocket science. Particularly funny is that Sadiq Khan wants to potentially ban all private vehicles in central London. Does he? I didn't. Well, the proposed no-car zone, as I understand it, being around half a mile from where Starmer's accident took place. Is he... Aaron did some of my notes for this bit, but is Sadiq Khan going to ban all private vehicles in central London?
It was being touted, so it doesn't... Because obviously Starmer lives in Kentish Town.
Yeah.
The zone for this would be from Euston in the north to Waterloo, so very, very close to this zone. And so, the reasoning behind it is the research you just cited, which is that SUVs aren't particularly safe. They can be very high emission. I mean, in his defence, I believe we might be wrong here. Starmer's vehicle is hybrid. That's good, great. It's better than diesel, but from both the green aspect, but also from a public safety aspect, you don't need an SUV. People are saying, "Oh, he's got a family. He's got 2 kids." Right? He hasn't got 5 kids and 3 Labradors. Give me a break. I've seen people that, I've got a child, I need a 4x4. You have 1 kid. Come on, this is ridiculous. A family saloon car is called a family saloon for a reason. You can fit 2 people and 2 kids in it. He doesn't need an SUV. He doesn't need it. It's much less safe for other people. By the way, actually, what's really remarkable with SUVs is they're less safe for the driver.
Really?
You're more at risk driving an SUV than not, because people are far less cautious. Which is
because you think you're king of the world.
Yeah, exactly. And so they're a bad idea. And there's been loads of protests against SUVs in Germany, right? You're seeing thousands of people protest in Germany saying, look, if you're hit by, let's say 5 people are hit by a car, 10 people are hit by a car, right? 5 of them are hit by a hatchback, 5 of them are hit by an SUV, right? Twice as likely. That's quite a big deal. Imagine if you had a brother or sister that was hit by a 4x4 and they died. You'd feel quite passionate about this. And some people are more opposed. John Stone, by the way, independent journalist, great friend of the show, outstanding Twitter account to follow. He always tweets about how we need more sort of cycling infrastructure in London. He tweets about it all the time. And then people are like, "Oh, you're out for Starmer." And he got trolled. I hope it's temporarily he's deleted his account. This is a serious point here, especially in the context of the pandemic. We're talking about how to envision different kinds of transport infrastructure. It should not have SUVs.
Isn't the more interesting... Well, I mean, that is interesting, but isn't the interesting thing that he drove away... So he obviously stopped. It wasn't hit and run. Although it does seem like he stopped to say, "How the hell did you not see me?" to the cyclist. But
and the cyclist said that to him.
Oh, the cyclist said that to him?
I believe that's how it's written strangely. Yeah,
okay. Yeah. But didn't he drove off before the police arrived?
Yeah.
Well, that's disputed because they
No, no,
say
that's
they
not-
say he waited. The police say he left.
No. So I tweeted earlier on saying he left before an ambulance arrived. That's not true. He was there for the ambulance. He left before the police arrived. Initially, he said, and you've got briefings and counter briefings, right? And ultimately, the Daily Mail are the only ones actually pursuing this story. This is the sad thing. The Guardian will not cover the story, right? That's just how politics works. Just like the Telegraph wouldn't cover a similar story with Boris Johnson. Despite the Guardian, the centre-left always love to pitch themselves as the principled, truth-seeking journalists. When it's their people, no, not really. See Kamal Ahmed when he was at The Observer and his closest to Alistair Campbell around the Iraq War. That's why they supported it. So what you're hearing is briefings and counter-briefings. What we know is he left before the police arrived. He initially said he left his details with an off-duty British Transport Police officer. Now, it apparently that's not accurate. This is obviously a developing story. Apparently, it was a PCSO. So that's not a police officer.
Oh, police community support officer.
Right.
Close enough, though, isn't it? Really?
Well, I don't know. You should really wait for the police. And it was a Sunday, midday. He was going to the tailor. It wasn't like, because he's a busy guy. I get that, right? Keir Starmer, he wants to be the next Prime Minister. He's got a chock-a-block schedule. I get that. It's a Sunday at 12 o'clock. You can't wait around for the police, really? You've something more important in your day than
maybe the police community support officer told him he could go.
Maybe. I don't know.
They haven't said that, though.
Look, maybe I'm not. This is not well, it is a dig at Keir Starmer. It's not a politically. No, it's not politically. It's not a politically motivated thing here. Firstly, there's that you're trying to champion a Green New Deal, yet you drive an SUV. I can't take you particularly seriously there. Secondly, we're in a political context where your colleague, the Labour London mayor, is saying we need everybody to get on bikes, and yet his boss, is doing the precise opposite. And then you've got this other aspect. I had a Labour councillor saying the Novara media establishment, effectively saying I was shit-stirring. I said, my God, I would hope you as a Labour councillor, if you knocked a cyclist over on your car, you would wait around for the police. As a Labour councillor, of course he didn't reply because he knows I'm absolutely correct. But this wasn't a Labour councillor. This was the leader of the Labour Party. So it's an immensely important story.
It's an interesting story.
It's an important story. As a conscientious citizen, you should stick around.
It was better look. It was a better look for Jeremy Corbyn to be cycling around London with his helmet on, like environmentally friendly, very humble, than driving in your big sports utility vehicle to a tailor, isn't it?
I mean, this is the thing. Nobody knows who Keir Starmer is. Nobody knows who he is. We know who he was when he was 35. He was a principled, campaigning, activist lawyer. We don't really know who the guy is now, his value system, and we need to know. And it's not just Labour members, supporters, people on the left. He wants to be the Prime Minister. He's going to have to basically demonstrate who he is, his sort of core of values. A guy on a Sunday driving to his tailor in an SUV, knocking a Deliveroo driver off their bike and then driving off before the police arrive, that doesn't scream to me somebody who's altruistic. Now, I don't know the reasons behind that. Maybe there was something he had to be at, perhaps. He should probably say what they are.
I'll take that. I wonder if he will. Let's see how this develops. But as you say, only the Daily Mail are particularly interested in covering it. The Guardian aren't touching it. Right, we've got 2,000 people watching. We've finished all our stories now. But we've only got 700 likes. We can definitely get to over 1,000 before we end the stream. And before we end the stream, let's go to a couple more super chats. Gum with a quid. Thank you very much. And ZX Spectrum. Oh, it was so great to meet you briefly, Michael, at Trans Pride. Love Novara Media. Nice to catch the show live today, Alex B. What a wonderful day. Trans Pride was very good. All right, we are going to wrap up now. Aaron Bastani, it's been a pleasure as always.
My pleasure.
Thank you for watching Tysky Sour on Novara Media. We will be back on Friday. I forgot what day it was. I was going to say we'll be back on Friday at 7 p.m, but actually, we're going to be back tomorrow at 7 p.m. Because tomorrow the EHRC report into Labour anti-Semitism is out. It's going to be a big political day. I know that both Keir Starmer is going to be speaking about it, Jeremy Corbyn is going to be speaking about it in the day. I'm going to be joined by Rivka Brown, Novara Media reporter, and we're going to be going through what's in it and also, the political fallout surrounding it. So do make sure you tune in tomorrow at 7 p.m. and then we'll be back for a normal episode of Tysky Sour on Friday. So there we are. You've been watching Tysky Sour on Novara Media. Good night.